What's up, guys? D-Rock 1992 here. The James Bond film series has been one of the most enduring, one of the most popular film series of all time. It has a lot of memorable movies. It has some duds of movies. It has some movies that aren't as memorable. But this series has given us some great actors who have played James Bond. It's given us some great villains, great Bond girls, great action scenes, great moments, great everything. This film series is third on the overall highest grossing film series list. Only behind the Marvel series, which is number 2, and number 1 is the Harry Potter film series. So I thought that for this video, I would rank from 25 to 1, my favorite Bond films of all time. Now I know, before I get into it, I know that there are 23 Bond films in the Eon series, Eon Productions, that are counted as official in the Bond canon. But I also am counting the Casino Royale 1967 version and Never Say Never Again, two unofficial Bond films. I am counting those because I've watched them and I consider them James Bond as well, even if they're unofficial James Bond films. So with that in mind, I'm going to get right into the list. Number 25 is the one I just mentioned, the Casino Royale 1967 version. This one's the only Bond film that I will probably never watch again, because for one thing, it is tough to, I think it's tough to get on video or DVD or anything like that, and also, mostly it sucks. It's just not a good film. I mean, it was meant to be a parody of Bond and spy films of the 60s. So it had its audience, definitely. It had its tailored audience. Just when I watched it for the first time, I thought it was a weird movie. And my little review of it, I also came up with reviews for these Bond movies as well. And for Casino Royale, the 1967 version, I give it a 1.5 out of 5. It's just a very disappointing Bond film. I expected good things going into it, but I really didn't get very much. There is a scene at the end, however, that is pretty good. I mean, pretty madcap, but funny. A little bit. But overall, this Bond film, if I never see it again, I won't be disappointed at all. Number 24 is Dr. No. This one's definitely controversial because Dr. No is up there as one of the greatest Bond films of all time. Dr. No has a 98% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which is the highest of any Bond film ever. But I think it's an overrated Bond film by far. I really do, because, well, for one thing, the Bond girl, Honey Ryder. You remember the one scene in Dr. No where she comes out of the water in her bikini. That's an iconic shot, and she's singing Underneath the Mango Tree. So that's really it. That's the only memorable thing that Ursula Andress as Honey Ryder has to offer for this movie. She really is not a good Bond girl. Except for that one iconic scene, she really has nothing else to offer. She's just there with James Bond. This is Sean Connery's first Bond film, and this is the first Bond film in the series. So you expect it to, a lot of people thought that this movie really hit a home run when it came out, and critical reception and all that. I thought it was a building block to the next Bond film on the list, the next Bond film, one that I'll be talking about later on in this list. But I mean, it was just that. It was a building block. It was poor. I mean, I know it's the 1960s. I know it was the first Bond film, but the picture quality on it was pretty awful compared to the other Bond films. Just not very good. It's too dry for me. I mean, I like my Bond with a combination of dry humor and madcap, campy fun. I mean, I basically like that, but this movie was just pretty much too dry for me. Dr. No, the main villain, played by a guy named Joseph Wiseman, just not a memorable villain. Not per se. I mean, pretty droll, dull, pretty droll, pretty dry. Just didn't really do it for me. So overall, I give it 3 out of 5 stars. So I give it a positive review because there are aspects of the movie that I do like. The end sequence is pretty good. Sean Connery does not do a bad job as Bond at all. He does a pretty admirable job. I wouldn't say an unbelievable job, but an admirable job nonetheless. There are memorable scenes in the movie. Maybe I am being a little too fair to the movie, but I give it 3 out of 5 because it's a solid Bond entry, not a great one, and it really served as the beginning of something special. Number 23 on my list is one that a lot of Bond fans put at the very bottom. It is towards my bottom. It is Roger Moore's last Bond film, A View to a Kill. He shouldn't have played Bond in this one. There's no doubt. I mean, he really shouldn't have, because Roger Moore was 58 when he played James Bond, and there was a lot of criticism directed towards him for doing that. He played Bond too old. I mean, the Bond girl in this movie, who her name escapes me right now, but the Bond girl in this movie is old enough to be Roger Moore's daughter. That's creepy. That's pretty darn creepy right there. And then it's kind of creepy, but the youngest Bond girl, if you can really call her a Bond girl, is in this movie. Her name's Jenny Flex, played by an actress named Alison Doody. And she was age 18 or 19 when she starred in A View to a Kill. And Roger Moore, 58. I mean, luckily there were no scenes between them where they were in love or having sex or anything like that. Luckily not, because that would have just been more creepy. This movie's just not extremely memorable. There are memorable moments, and I like it enough to give it a 3 out of 5 stars. I mean, it's good enough in that aspect. Christopher Walken as the main villain is a good villain. He's a good villain in the franchise. Christopher Walken's an amazing actor anyway, so for him to be in a Bond film, it's just really good for the Bond franchise. But at times Roger Moore and James Bond seemed irritable. Maybe he didn't put 100% in it. I'm not really sure. I can't really tell any of that stuff in movies, but this is Roger Moore's worst one, for sure. The Bond girl, even, that I mentioned, she wasn't very memorable. Not really. Just another ditzy Bond girl. I don't really have anything extremely positive to say about her. But there are some scenes that are good. I mean, there's a scene where Bond is in San Francisco, I think, in a fire truck evading police. That's a pretty good scene right there. There are also some other good ones. Mayday is a Bond henchwoman in this movie, and she's pretty good. I don't dislike her or anything like that. It's a pretty solid casting. But yeah, overall this one got a 36% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, and I can kind of see why. Maybe it was a little unfair to do it that low, but this is one of the lowest Bond films in the whole series. A lot of people would consider it the lowest point of the series, and I would definitely understand why people would think that way. Number 22, Octopussy. This is the second to last Roger Moore film. He also showed his age in this movie, in this film. I think the Bond girl, who is named Octopussy, Octopussy is one of the great double entendres in Bond history. There have been many of them. There's one particular one I'm going to be talking about later that everybody knows, even non-Bond fans. But Octopussy in particular, the Bond girl of Octopussy, she's okay. I don't really have great memories of her, but I mean, she's not the worst Bond girl ever. That's coming up. You'll get a hoot out of that one, but she's just not that extremely memorable to me. There's a henchman named Gobinda, if I'm pronouncing the name right. He's a tough Bond villain, a tough Bond henchman, he's menacing, he's okay, not the most memorable Bond henchman. The Bond villain, the main Bond villain, is a prince, I believe, and he's okay. This movie's okay. It gets pretty ridiculous in one part of the movie where Bond is evading West German police, and he's in the forest trying to evade the main Bond villain, and he lets out a Tarzan cry. That is not James Bond. That's Bond being Tarzan, or George of the Jungle, or something like that. That's just not... It got... Don't get me wrong, I like the campy aspect of Bond. I do like it. Just it wasn't utilized extremely properly in A View to a Kill or Octopussy. Octopussy has a 42% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. I give it a 3 out of 5 stars personally. There are moments that I enjoy in the film, and it's a rewatchable film. Maybe not as rewatchable as some of the other Bond films, but still rewatchable, So, 42% is definitely... I agree with it, kind of. But I give it a positive review still, because I will watch it again, definitely. I will watch all of these Bond films on the list again. They have rewatchability, except for that Casino Royale 1967 version. So Octopussy's my number 22. Number 21 is the first Pierce Brosnan Bond film on this list. Die Another Day. His last Bond film. He was 52, I believe, when he did this film. Die Another Day is a pretty good version of Bond. I mean, it's a good version, but it's not great. This one really introduced CGI to the Bond series. And that had a mixed bag, because the CGI in it and some of the events in the Bond film made it not look like a Bond film. There were moments in this Bond movie where it just didn't feel like Bond to me. Pierce Brosnan does a good job as Bond. He still, he does a good job as Bond. It's a pretty good portrayal. Halle Berry's in this film. She plays Jinx. It's a pretty good portrayal. I like it, It's not the best Bond girl ever, but it's good. Miranda Frost, played by Rosamund Pike, is a Bond henchwoman, a double traitor, and she plays a pretty good villain. She's probably, depending on when you ask me, she probably is one of the most memorable parts of the movie. Her part, was a pretty good part. The Bond villain, in particular, is okay. Not the best Bond villain, but not the worst either. And I don't really have much else to say. Just, There are moments where it doesn't feel like a Bond film, but it's a good entry in the Bond film, regardless. And it gets my first 3.5-star rating out of 5. So it definitely is memorable. But it was almost a good thing that Pierce Brosnan made it his last film. It was time for him to go after that. Number 20 is another Sean Connery film. This one I don't have much memory about, so I have it at the bottom of my list, towards the bottom of my list, kind of because I don't really have a lot of memorable things about it. It is the 4th Bond film in the franchise, Thunderball. The Bond villain, there's a Bond henchwoman in the film, Fiona Volpe in this film, who is okay. She's pretty, she's pretty memorable somewhat. Largo, who is the main villain, who is number 2 in the Spectre organization, he's okay in the film. I think he is a pretty good Bond villain in the Bond franchise. I've heard a lot of things that say that he's not the best Bond villain in the franchise. He's okay to me. He's okay. Definitely not the best Bond villain, but there's a quality to him. The way he looks makes him look like a Bond villain. It definitely is there. The henchmen for Bond aren't that great. There's a main Bond villain named Vargas that just is there. He doesn't really have a personality of his own. I like my Bond villain henchman to have personality. He doesn't really have a lot of it. And it's long. It's a pretty dragged out movie. Regardless, though, it is a good Bond film, definitely. One I'd watch over and over again. I give it 3.5 stars out of 5. So, number 19 is a Roger Moore film. It is the second Roger Moore film in the series, The Man with the Golden Gun. In this one, at this point, it was kind of tough to put Thunderball below The Man with the Golden Gun, because The Man with the Golden Gun has one glaring quality on it that makes it low on this list, and that is the Bond girl. Mary Goodnight, without a doubt, is the dumbest Bond girl of all time. And I don't particularly like her as a Bond girl. She's dumb. Bond girls need depth and character and things like that, and this Bond girl does not have it at all. She's just not very effective. The other Bond girl in this one is played by Maud Adams, who played Octopussy in the Octopussy movie. She was okay. The highlight of this film, however, is Christopher Lee as the villain, Francisco Scaramanga, or the Man with the Golden Gun. He is the highlight of this film. The guy who plays the little midget named Knick-Knack is pretty good as well. This one is definitely one of the lowest Roger Moore films. It's not the best film, but it's a pretty good film. Rewatchability, like I said, for most of the Bond films. And I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. Number 18 is yet another Roger Moore film. A lot of people have it towards the top of the list, but I actually have it towards the bottom because for some reason, it's just not one of my favorite Bond films, The Spy Who Loved Me. It gives us the introduction of Jaws. Jaws is a good Bond henchman. He's probably the most well-known Bond henchman of all time. Next to another one who I will be talking about later on this list. But anyway, he does get introduced. The villain, Carl Stromberg is his last name. Stromberg is okay. He's a pretty good Bond villain and all that. But the Bond girl's not that good. Not that great. Anya Anasova, or Agent Triple X, for the reason I don't know if I pronounced the name right, I'm going to call her Triple X, because that was her agent name. Triple X, played by Barbara Bach, who is actually, believe it or not, married to Ringo Starr, Beatles drummer, former Beatles drummer. Barbara Bach is not a great Bond girl. She appears wooden at times. It's just not the best Bond girl portrayal. And she's in the majority of the film, so it kind of brings down the film a little bit for me. There are some slow moments in this Bond film. But the battle sequence at the end is one of the best battle sequences in Bond history, where Bond's allies battle Stromberg's henchmen in a submarine. That puts it over the top for me. That puts it over the top of all the other films that I mentioned. Spy Who Loved Me gets a 3.5 stars out of 5. And I will watch that movie for that battle sequence alone. It's such a good battle sequence. But it's number 18 on my list for a reason. It's just not the most memorable Bond film or my favorite Bond film of all time. Number 17 is... A lot of Bond fans would probably have this lower on the list. It actually is a most recent Bond adaptation, Quantum of Solace. One of the Bond films on my list with Daniel Craig is very high. For a reason. That film is a lot better than Quantum of Solace. Quantum of Solace is a good entry. I think it's underrated. I think it's kind of underrated. The Bond villain may not be the most memorable, or may be the weakest of the Bond villains. He probably is, what's his name? I can't really remember what his name was, but it's definitely a name. It's not like it was badly critically reviewed, however. 65% on Rotten Tomatoes is not a bad rating on Rotten Tomatoes at all. It's not great, but it's solid enough. Just with Quantum of Solace, it's a good Bond film. The henchman in the Bond film really does nothing for me. The main villain's henchman does really nothing for me. The Bond villain is not the best, but he's not the worst. I mean, it's just... he's okay, basically. It'd be very hard, by the way, to put up a Bond villain list, because there have been so many good ones and so many great ones in the history of Bond. This one's okay. Does enough for the film. The Bond girl is... actually, I like the dynamic between the Bond girl and Bond, because they actually don't... I think it's pretty neat that they actually don't sleep with each other. They're not, like, the Bond girl does not get seduced by Bond. I think that's pretty neat. But then again, it should happen in every Bond movie, because that's a precedent. Bond beds his Bond girl. That's pretty much the precedent for every Bond film. But in this one, it's not really the fact. Not really the case. And it actually is okay. Because the main Bond girl, carries over from... The focus of this film carries over from the previous film. And it would just seem... pretty dickish of Bond to, if dickish is a word, of Bond to bed this Bond girl. The Bond girl herself is pretty solid, not a great Bond girl, not a terrible Bond girl or anything like that. And so I think it's underrated. I think it's a Bond film that deserves a little more than what fans give it. But there is a reason why it's low on my list. It's just not my favorite Bond film of the series. Number 16 is going to... If I get a lot of views on this list, people are going to crucify me for this. But it is my list, and Goldfinger at number 16 is number 16 on my list. I know it is at the top of most people's lists. It is the Bond that is viewed as really what made James Bond. You know, really solidified the James Bond as we know him today. That movie really did great for that, and that's great. That's absolutely great. It just isn't. I'm still giving it a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think it's a good film, but it's not a great film. There are issues with it. Pussy Galore, which is one of the greatest double entendres ever. She is the main Bond girl, played by an actress named Honor Blackman. She's underused in this one. I liked her character a lot. The Bond girl, she had a good Bond girl impression. Or, you know, she had a good Bond girl portrayal. But she was underused. I would have liked to see more of her. The Bond girl, I don't really love how one of the most famous Bond girls of all time, her name's Jill Masterson, I think. Tiffany Masterson, something like that. I don't really like how she got killed off immediately. I would have liked to see a little more from her. The sister, Bond teams up with the sister of this Masterson chick who tries to avenge her sister's death from the hands of Goldfinger. She's okay, not the most memorable in the movie though. Probably the least memorable. And then Goldfinger, not the best Bond villain ever. He really isn't. He's just big, blubbering. He's just a big, blubbering villain. You know, he has a memorable line. There is a memorable line in Goldfinger, which, you know, it's one of the most memorable lines of all time. And Sean Connery goes, "Do you expect me to talk? Do you expect me to talk?" Goldfinger said, "No, Mr. Bond, I expect you to die!" In this Goldfinger accent that he does. Goldfinger is dubbed. The actor who played Goldfinger was dubbed over, which I didn't particularly love them doing. I understand it because he had a heavy German accent. I think he was German, the guy who played Goldfinger. I don't think he's the most memorable Bond villain of all time. For some reason, he's just not high on my list. However, there is a positive, however, and that's Oddjob. He is one of the best Bond villains, or Bond henchmen of all time. Oddjob is widely known. Of course, he has the hat that, he has the hat that can break a statue. He has a hat that can kill people. Steel-rimmed hat is what it is. And despite him not saying a whole lot, he's pretty much a silent character throughout the entire movie. He is still memorable because he's threatening. He's a big man. He's strong. He's just a very memorable Bond henchman. And he is probably the highlight of the film. And Sean Connery does not do a bad job as James Bond. I mean, he is good. He is a good James Bond. People have Sean Connery on their list, high up on their list, for a reason. He does a good job in this Bond movie. I give it 3.5 out of 5. I probably could have given it lower because of all the issues that I described, but still, this is a movie that I'll watch. Definitely. It's just not one of my favorites. Number 15 is it is the campiest Bond film, the campiest, silliest Bond film of all time. And I actually rather like it. Diamonds Are Forever. It's very campy. Sean Connery is a lot older in this one. This one came out in 1971. And it's very campy. It's very tongue-in-cheek. It's very, it pokes fun at the audience. It's basically a non-parody. It's basically the parody that isn't the parody of James Bond. A parody that's not meant to be a parody of James Bond. If you get what I mean, I think that's how best I can describe it. There are some ridiculous scenes in it. There are two main Bond henchmen in particular, Mr. White and Mr. Kidd, who are actually, it's hinted that they are a gay couple. One of really the first Bond movies to really portray that. One of the only Bond henchman characters that really have that distinction, kind of, that really hint at them being gay. They're a hilarious duo. They're a pretty good entry into the Bond series. The Bond girl, Tiffany Case, is not the most memorable Bond girl. She's one of the least Bond girls in the series, in my opinion. She's not the best actor. Jill St. John plays her. But, regardless, she does okay with Bond. Bond just looks older in this one. There is another one where Bond is older that I like a lot better. Don't get me wrong about this, but yeah, Bond shows his age in this one. I don't think it really affects him. Blofeld himself, who is the main villain, Ernst Stavro Blofeld, the most well-known Bond villain perhaps in the whole series, the version of Blofeld played by an actor named Charles Gray, he also played a Bond ally in the movie. He's one of only a few people who have played a Bond ally and a Bond villain. And Charles Gray is one of them. So, his Blofeld portrayal is probably the worst of all the Blofeld portrayals, but it's not bad at all. It's a good portrayal. But there are other portrayals of Blofeld that are better. Saying this, I give it 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think it's a very enjoyable film. It's a film that, if there are a lot of fans that like the campy James Bond, this one's the movie for them. This one defines campy. So that is my number 15, Diamonds Are Forever. Number 14 is The World Is Not Enough. It is the third Pierce Brosnan Bond in the series. And it definitely has one of the most disliked Bond girls of all time. Christmas Jones, played by Denise Richards. My personal opinion on it is that by no means, she is not the best Bond girl. By far. There have been very more superior Bond girls than her. But I also give her a little bit of credit. She actually doesn't do a bad job in the film. She doesn't really bring down the film at all or anything like that. She's actually pretty entertaining as the Bond girl. But she's not the main Bond girl, and that's the issue, kind of. The other Bond girl's name, Electra King, she by far gives the better portrayal of a Bond girl than Denise Richards did as Christmas Jones. That's a fact right there. Excuse me, she just gives a performance. This French actress named Sophie Marceau plays Electra King, and it's a very good portrayal. I like it that M has more of a focus in this movie. M, who is Bond's superior, because she actually is played by Judi Dench. I forgot to mention that in Die Another Day and the other Bond films with her, but Judi Dench was very important for M, first of all, because before her, all the M characters, all the portrayals of M were male portrayals. Judi Dench was the first female. I like it that M got more of a focus in this film because not just the person behind the scenes that directs Bond to every mission, like she or he has done since the inception of Bond. I like it that she has a little more of a role. There is one other Bond film in particular that she has a huge role in, and she's considered the Bond girl. She really is considered it. But yeah, The World Is Not Enough. It's it's a good Bond film. It really is. Robbie Coltrane as Valentin Zukovsky is a pretty good Bond ally in the film. Who plays the guy who plays Renard? Robert Carlyle, I think, is his name. He's an okay Bond villain, not the best Bond villain ever, but he gives an alright portrayal. For some reason, it's just not up there with, it's just my third favorite out of the Pierce Brosnan films. It's just another Bond film, but it's a good Bond film that I'll watch over and over again. I give it a 4 out of 5 stars. It's a good Bond film. A solid entry in the series, definitely. It's a good entry. Number 13 is one that I was a little confused about when I first saw it. After I first saw it in theaters, I was a little confused as to who the main villain was. After a couple rewatches, though, it got higher on my list. I liked it better the second, third time I watched it. And number 13 is the Casino Royale, the 2006 version, or the reboot of James Bond. Bond was in trouble after 2002's Die Another Day. Die Another Day did not get the great critical reception. It made money, but it did not get the great critical reception. And there was a 4-year layover in which I think MGM was in bankruptcy or something like that. And there was a lot of turmoil in MGM, in the Eon Productions and all that. This is the first one to have Daniel Craig as James Bond, a move that was widely criticized by a lot of Bond people. There were websites that condemned Craig's casting as James Bond, petitioning for him to be removed as James Bond, and boycotting the movie if James Bond was going to be played by Daniel Craig. That's how much Bond fans did not like him. However, he gives a good performance in Casino Royale. He really does. Here's a James Bond that's a wounded James Bond. He's very flawed. He's very, he's a cold-blooded, flawed killer. It's how best I can describe it. He, it's a good portrayal and all that. The villain, Lashif, who the main villain in this is this guy named Mr. White, the leader of a organization called Quantum, I believe. But Mr. White isn't in this film much of the time. He's only in the film for like a couple scenes. The villain who is primarily mentioned, who is primarily in the Casino Royale film, is Lashif. Lashif is a good Bond villain. He's a very intricate, complicated, not really complicated, but intricate Bond villain. He's also a flawed Bond villain because he is under the superiority of Mr. White. He works for Mr. White. He's trying to win him money, or else he's going to be killed, basically. And the villain is good, definitely. But, and M gives a good performance as well. Judi Dench does a good job as M. But the highlight of Casino Royale is the Bond girl, Vesper Lynd, who's played by Eva Green. She is quite possibly the best Bond girl in the whole series, in my opinion. She really gets at James Bond. I mean, when a Bond girl is one of the few that can get James Bond to fall in love with her, the Bond girl's doing her job. She's doing an exemplary job. It's just a very good Bond girl, very good Bond girl, a tragic Bond girl, I'm not going to spoil it, but a tragic Bond girl. You know, and it's just the chemistry between those two is good. It's definitely good. And I have positive things to say about it. The only big issue I have is the main villain isn't really featured a lot in the film. The major villain. But that's probably what the people for Casino Royale wanted to do. Keep him in the background a little bit. Keep the main villain, Mr. White, in the background. Casino Royale, for me, is a 4 out of 5 stars. It's a good Bond film, for sure. Number 12 is Moonraker, the 4th Bond film with Roger Moore. Moonraker is towards the bottom of most people's list. Moonraker was a film that was created after Star Wars. And Moonraker was influenced heavily by Star Wars and the sci-fi craze that hit the 1970s. That was Star Wars, basically. Moonraker came out in 1979, a couple years after Star Wars. And you can see throughout this film, it is a Star Wars... it's a Star Wars ripoff, but it's a good Star Wars ripoff. This is also the second film to feature Jaws as the henchman. I think a lot of people don't like this, but Jaws actually turns into a good guy at the end of the film. A lot of people, I think, actually don't like it. A lot of people that I've looked at, a lot of videos on YouTube, stuff like that, they've said that they don't quite like the move of Jaws turning good. I don't mind it, It's what the people wanted that created Moonraker, so it's what they did. The villain in the film is pretty good, Hugo Drax. It's a good portrayal. It definitely is close. The one complaint I have about it is the monotone performance of Dr. Holly Goodhead. Another double entendre, by the way. Dr. Holly Goodhead, the woman who plays her, it's just not the best portrayal. She's very monotone, very droll and dull. And all that. She's a hot Bond girl, but she's a droll and just dull Bond girl. Not one of the best, by far. Really, the only complaint I have about it, it's a good Bond film regardless. And it gets a 4 out of 5 stars from me. Number 11 is probably, again, towards the bottom of most people's list. And the actor who played Bond in this film definitely is at the bottom of the list. He's towards the bottom of my list. Number 11 is On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This film gets lost in the shuffle tremendously when you consider James Bond. Different guy played it. George Lazenby comes in and plays James Bond for the first and only time. And a lot of people give George Lazenby crap for playing James Bond. They give negative reviews and all that, but, as we've gone past 1969, which was when the film came out, a lot of critical reception has been better towards Lazenby. I actually think he didn't do a bad job at all. He is the worst Bond out of the official James Bonds. He is the worst out of all of them. But he doesn't do a bad job at all. I think he does a commendable job as James Bond. Yes, there are certain qualities of George Lazenby's Bond that kind of turn me off, like his boyish charm. That's just not James Bond. The way he exhibits boyish charm, it's just not James Bond to me. But that's really the only complaint I have about Lazenby's Bond. I think it's a good, solid James Bond. I don't think he's the best character in the movie, even though it's a Bond film. The woman who... the Bond girl who he marries, the only Bond girl that he marries, is Teresa Te Contessa, if I'm saying the name right. Diana Rigg plays her. She does a great job as the Bond girl. She's one of the best Bond girls in the series. Blofeld. The version of Blofeld played by Telly Savalas, I think, is the strongest Bond in the series. He is a good Bond villain. He's the most menacing Blofeld we've seen. The most physical Blofeld we've seen, and that's a good thing. He's kind of Bond's equal in a way. There's a battle sequence at the end between Blofeld's men and Bond's allies that is really good. It's one of the best battle sequences. And overall, it is a good film. It's a very good film. It's an underrated film tremendously. It's not the most underrated film. Excuse me for a moment, my phone.